Hello, Paul Johnson here. I'm with the Optimistic American. You know, we exist because we want to try to help rekindle the American spirit. Today's show is right in line with that. We're going to talk about the divisions that exist inside of America and whether or not they're resolvable. We're also going to talk about the connections between those divisions and what we wrote about in our book, Addictive Ideologies, and the connection between terrorism, genocide, as well as extremist movements in the United States. But last, you're going to see that we tie all this back in to the Optimistic American and why it is that you should feel that you can be proud of who we are and, for that matter, optimistic about where it is that we're going. Now, if you watch the nightly news, this is what you've probably been seeing. It's about this struggle that exists in America, seemingly between the right and the left, the extremists on both groups, and it seems to have captivated the United States. This is the perception. The perception is that this country is divided in half and that there are only really two groups of people. Well, the reality is, and I hope that we prove this to you during this show, is that those extreme factions that exist on the far right and the far left, they really represent a very small portion of the population. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't represent a large portion of the people who vote in the primary. But the bottom line to it is, overwhelmingly, most Americans just simply don't buy into the extreme actions that are being taken by either side. In our book, Addictive Ideologies, we talk about the connections between genocide and extremist movements. My partner, Dr. Bashah, her family they were persecuted by Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party. Many of them were tortured and they had to leave. And she gained a great understanding of what actually happens when extremist movements turn into genocides. But just as importantly, she's also spent time doing forensic exams of terrorists and other people who are engaged in extremist movements. Now, from my standpoint, I've been more involved in the social side. I was mayor of the city of Phoenix, and I spent a lot of time in political campaigns throughout the country, from presidential campaigns all the way down to local races. And what I've seen, or what we've both seen, is that there is a connection. So let's talk about, just for a moment, those genocides that took place that all kind of stemmed from an extremist movement. You'll see that there are a variety of them that have happened inside of the 21st century. In fact, if you ever doubt that evil exists, if you just look back at the 21st century, I think it becomes almost undeniable that evil exists. Now, the question is that evil some other group, or is it actually something inside of each one of us? And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in Germany in 1945, you saw that somewhere near about 6 million people were killed inside the genocide. I think it's important to recognize when you look at that didn't happen because of one person. To kill millions of people, it took millions of people participating. You can find it with communist China in the 1950s and 1960s. The Great Leap Forward was an idea based around an ideology that focused on how it is that the Chinese government could turn into an industrial nation. They did that by taking property away from other people. Now, here's the problem when you take somebody's property. They won't shut up. They won't go quiet. The estimates are that they killed in the Great Leap Forward anywhere between 15 and 60 million people, many of them just by starving to death. Like all the other places that I'll mention here, I've been to Cambodia. There was a regime called the Khmer Rouge with Pol Pot. Pol Pot had a rural revolution that took place, and they invaded Phnom Penh and literally took the millions of people that were located there and relocated them out into the rural areas. And then they began a systematic genocide to kill those people whom they disagreed with. We know that they killed over 2 million people inside of Cambodia. In Rwanda, it was an issue between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And this was just in 1994. Now, in this particular genocide, literally, there were a group of people who made up the majority of the populations, the Hutu, about 98%, and they were told that they were being oppressed by the 2% of the population who were Tutsis. And it began to become something that was actually taught inside the schools. So the educational system became one of the culprits in it. When they were done, they killed over 1 million people. And then my partner and I, Dr. Bashah, just got back from Bosnia. Now, Bosnia used to be a part of Yugoslavia. There was a leader by the name of Tito. Tito was able to hold together all these disparate nations, Serbia, Croatia, Macedonia, Bosnia. But when he died, there was no succession plan. And immediately the Russians, who were upset that Yugoslavia had always been in the Western sphere, began to feed armaments as well as antagonizing the Serbians to actually go out and invade Bosnia. They did. Now, the way that they did it, Bosnia had both Serbians, Croatians, as well as Muslims or Bosniaks inside of their nation. About 40% of them were Muslim. Well, the idea was if they got rid of the Muslims, they thought that they could actually win a public vote that would end up making Bosnia part of Serbia. Now, the first town that they entered into, they literally gathered up about 24,000 people. And they told them, the general told them, you can watch this on a YouTube video where the general said, you know, you mean nothing to us. It is nothing for us to kill you. You can either get on the bus and we'll relocate you, or you can die right here. Well, they got on the bus, men on one bus, women on another, and it wasn't very long before they ended up in a place where they were exterminated. After they did that in 2 or 3 other villages, word began to get out that it was happening. And of course, at that point, not only would no one get on the bus, they wouldn't even come to the village. But what you end up seeing when you're there is this horrific experience of how these people were treated. Now, one of the stories that we had was a story of a trench where literally there were thousands of people being put into this open trench, and there were Serbians as well as some civilians literally putting dirt down onto the bodies. The Dutch soldiers who were there as part of what were considered to be peacekeepers said that they just weren't putting it down on people who were dead. They were actually putting it down on people who were still alive. There's evidence that many of those people actually ended up being buried alive. You can see here in this picture that actually is evidence of that taking place. Our question is, how do you get to that point? How is it that you lose your humanity and you begin to buy into the idea that it's all right not only to kill these people, but to kill them in horrendous ways, such as burying them alive? All those genocides have similarities. In fact, all acts of genocide, terrorism, in fact, the extremist movements that happened before them and that maybe are happening here in the United States today, all have similarities. The first similarity is that they all tie to an ideology. And the second similarity that exists is that they all tie to tribalism. Again, we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but let's start by talking about the problem ideologies. Those ideologies that end up becoming not only problematic, but violent. Now, here's what we can tell you, is that it starts with the idea of an oppressed versus an oppressor. Those ideologies which say that there's a victim and that there's an oppressor are the ones that are the most at risk at becoming violent. Again, all of those movements are tied to ideologies, but the ones that become violent start with an oppressor and an oppressed. What you'll find is that those ideologies actually can become addictive. And they become addictive through a process. It starts with the loss of self-esteem. And in the loss of self-esteem, that comes because people lost something economically or socially. Socially meaning maybe they've been displaced as a population. I think one of the things that's led us to what seems to be happening on the right is that there are many areas where the white population has begun to see different types of pressure that they haven't seen in the past. And in some cases, in some areas, they've also been harmed economically. Those ideologies that become a problem always have an oppressor versus a victim. And the ones that we see that are the most problematic tie that oppressed versus oppressor to race. Now, I want to make certain I'm clear on this. That's not just a right issue. That's something that we're seeing happening both on the right and on the left. Then what happens is the person involved in the ideology ends up being isolated. They're isolated because as they begin to repeat this dogma, as they begin to buy into this ideology, they leave no real room for any constructive conversation. And so people that care about them, the people who love them, begin to distance themselves from them. And that begins to isolate them and move them towards other people who are ideological as well. There's lots of research on this point, and here's the bottom line. When you do that, the likelihood of them becoming more violent or becoming violent dramatically increases. Now, I want to talk for a moment just about ideology's addictive qualities. And it starts with this. Everyone's brain is hooked on the idea of being right. If you get into an argument with someone, there is both dopamine as well as adrenaline that is released into your system that creates almost an artificial high. So what the ideology ends up helping provide for them is, first, it gives this very simplistic view of how the world works. It always has, these ideologies always have an oppressor who they begin to objectify, and then it has the oppressed, which is them. And when you get into an argument after receiving the indoctrination or the dogma from one of these ideologies, oftentimes the person that you're arguing with, they haven't really been through the ropes on being able to answer those questions. And so it leaves people who oftentimes might not win an argument in a position where they start to feel like they won. And again, that is a high all on its own. Now, this concept isn't just a concept that we've come up with, although Dr. Bashah has done a lot of study on it. The reality is that this is something that's being seen by psychologists everywhere. And in this particular case, it was the Harvard Business Review. So let's spend now a few moments talking about the extremes, because what I don't want to do is to leave you with the position that this is just simply focused on one side. Now, there's what's called the alt-right. And by the way, they named themselves that. I didn't come up with that tagline. That's something they actually want to be called. But it's groups like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, Incel. If you haven't heard about Incel, that's a lovely group. It's a group of young men who believe that because of women who all are chasing the same guy, I think they call him Chad or something like that, that it has left many young men involuntary celibate. And they believe they have a right to sex. And so they believe they're being reverse raped. And so they've actually created a dogma. They've created a manifesto that talks about their right to be able to go out and pursue that. But if you start looking at the connections between these groups, one of the big connections, especially the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, many of the more radical people who are in the alt-right, what you find is that they really are connected by race. And what you'll hear from them all the time, the narrative of the alt-right, is what they call a white genocide, that there's this genocide that is taking place of white people, that they're being displaced. And they actually not only believe that, they're terrified by it, they're frightened by it. The radical left, postmodernism is where that starts. Postmodernism is not just a philosophy, it's also an ideology. And what postmodernism says, I won't go through all of the details with it for you, but what I will tell you is that they believe that there are no universal truths. And because of that, all that matters is power. And of course, they believe that there are a group of people that have power, the patriarchy, and a group of people that want it. So it's almost like flipping the totem pole on its head from the alt-right. And that starts to manifest itself in things like the 1619 Project. But the bottom line to it is, you'll hear from them, their narrative is that it's about white privilege. In both of these cases, what you find is that they're identifying people by the group that they're in, not by whether or not they're an individual. Now, our society, we have from our beginnings had this belief that every person should be judged as an individual. Now, it's true that had to expand. In the beginning, it was mostly white landowner men, but that expanded, and it expanded over a period of time where it not only started including women, African Americans, Hispanics, gays. Everybody began to see that they had a stake in this game and that they were deserving of dignity. But these extremes on both sides, that's not how they view society. They view it as that we should identify the other person by the group that they're in. They have what's called a victim mentality. They have a victim mindset. Now, what is a victim mindset? Well, victim mindset, I always have to be careful of because I tend to want to be the savior with family members and others who I see end up being a victim. And of course, what happens to the savior is that when you can no longer save them at long last, you become the bad guy, which means you're a victim too. And the indication in that is that you should try to be a coach as opposed to being a savior. But in the victim mindset, the victim always believes that there's an oppressor, a persecutor, and they begin to objectify them. They also have a very warped view of power. Now, their view of power is that the only reason that power is important is because it is a tool that is utilized to oppress the other group. And so they want power so they can oppress the group that they think is oppressing them. Their theory goes like this. It's that the person who in ancient times would have brought in the single largest buffalo, who was the best hunter, that would be the person with power because he would take it. In my experience, that's not how power works. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The guy who brings in, or the person who brings in the buffalo and says, hey, start by feeding the old people, and then make certain that the kids are taken care of, and make certain that everybody here gets an equal share, and I'll eat last. That's the person who ends up having the most sustainable power. The power that is sustainable is not power that's taken, it's power that's given. But again, these groups view power very, very differently. You see that, again, not only in the far right, but you see that in things like cancel culture. In fact, what you'll see with the far right, or the alt-right, is that they tend to push physical violence. But what happens with the radical left through cancel culture and other means, they focus on reputational violence. The fact that they call you a racist begins to cause damage to you. And if you're a professor and you know what's good for you, you'll keep your mouth shut. And sometimes even that doesn't work. Now then the challenge becomes what's called tribalism. Tribalism, many of you kind of know the idea, but let me try to flush that out a little bit more for you so you can think about it. Many members, many people who are a part of a tribe, or for that matter, a part of a party, they are not a part of the extreme groups. There's a really good book written by Jonathan Haidt, who is really one of my favorite authors, but he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. And in that, he talks about why good people are divided. Why are the rest of us, if these extremists only represent 2 or 3 or 4% of the public, why is it that the rest of us end up being divided as well? Well, it starts with this, social identification. Right? We don't really take part in a party because the political party represents the issues that we care about. Maybe in the beginning you had 1 or 2 issues that mattered, but you actually begin to socially identify with the group. And once you socially identify with the group, you're much more open to adopting the other ideas that group has as well. And then there's this thing called moral relativism. Right? Moral relativism is really about this concept of that in the beginning, let's say that you're a Democrat and you see someone who starts to use cancel culture. They maybe attack a professor, they call them racist, and you go, well, maybe he was doing something he shouldn't do. But after you hear them do that about 15 or 20 times, you kind of know that what they're doing is not right. But maybe in the beginning, even though you felt uneasy about it, you defended them. And then after a while, when it's no longer defensible, then you always have this one last excuse. And here's what it is. Well, what about your extremes? Look at what the alt-right is doing. That's what's happening on both sides today. The left is trying to defend their side by talking about the extreme right, and make no mistake about it, the right is trying to defend the violence that their group is doing by talking about the woke left. Cognitive dissonance is a really important concept. And cognitive dissonance is important because what cognitive dissonance is that each of us have this conflict between the groups that we belong to and the issues that we know that are moral. So that can play out in a variety of ways. I'm a CEO. I've been in business for a long time, and there are a lot of times I'll hang out with other CEOs. And sometimes many of those CEOs may have positions on things that I don't quite agree with. But I don't want to be the outcast. I don't want to be the person that they all disagree with. So maybe I mold my position a little bit. But at some point, with cognitive dissonance, you end up in this position where you know that you have these things that are immoral. In this particular case, you'll see the two girls in the background and the other girl in the front. But I want you, instead of focusing on the girl in the front who feels like she's been put out, focus on the girl who doesn't have her hand up to her face. There's literally this sense of her knowing what they're doing is wrong, right? But yet, because she wants to fit into the group, she's willing to go along with it. That's a psychological term that a lot of studies have been put into, and there's no doubt all of us face that pressure. Now, then that begins to move its way up through the political system. And what happens in the political system, we're watching this in real time today, is that politicians who were in a party, who had a whole set of values that for decades they talked to us about being important, they're starting to abandon them. And they're doing that because they recognize the power of fear. And what they really want is the ability to control the base. Now, here's what I'd like you to think about. It doesn't matter whether it's cancel culture or your politicians. There are a small group of people, let's say 2% of the population, that fit into what they call the dark triad of personality traits. Now, what I want you to think about is that every now and then, one of these people from cancel culture or that are coming across your Facebook feed or your Instagram feed, they're kind of like Christian Bale in the movie. I think it was called Psycho. I don't really know the exact name of the movie, but it was a good movie where they focused on this guy who was a psychopath, but yet he had these charismatic personality traits that gave him the ability to attract people into his sphere. So what the dark triad is it's a mixture between narcissism, psychopathy, as well as Machiavellianism. And again, every now and then those people exist. They're really not trying to focus on issues. What they're really trying to focus on is power and control. Now, in this battle, the media's just picked sides. So what you'll see if you watch Fox News is you'll get a disproportionate view of AOC. Right? Why? Because they see her as an extremist. And on the other hand, you'll see green up on the CNN program or MSNBC on a regular basis for the exact same reasons. And the people who are moderate, who are talking sense, who are logical, they're just simply not giving them play. They do that because there's riches in the niches. Here's the idea. There's a constant narrative in the media that is, if it bleeds, it leads. Now, why? Again, why are politicians doing that? Why does the news media do that? Well, it's called the amygdala hijack. And actually, I was told this by a pollster many, many years ago working in a presidential campaign. But the concept to the amygdala hijack goes like this. If I can figure out who you are, especially if you're involved in a tribe, and I can make you believe that your tribe is threatened, that you are threatened, I can engage that amygdala, the more reptilian portion of the brain. And what that does is it begins to overpower the neocortex. Now, the challenge with that is the neocortex is where optimism, rationalism, where you have the ability to create and to innovate, even love comes from that section of the brain. Once it overpowers it, all you can do is fight, flight, or freeze. Now, here's why that's an advantage. It's profitable. If I can do that to you, you're going to watch tomorrow to see what the resolution is. And of course, I like this slide. It's a consciousness within a dream. And that is because these narratives that are being made up by oftentimes these people with dark triad personalities are creating this story. And you exist in that story if you don't create your own. We all live within a story that we tell ourselves and a story that other people tell us. And if the story is, you're threatened, we're in trouble, the country's falling apart, there's no hope, that story, that narrative is going to have an effect on your psychology. And on the other hand, if you can find optimism and if you can find the belief that maybe it's going to be okay and that maybe I play a role in helping make it better, that's a very different narrative. In any event, all those things feed all the way back up to the extremists. And if done wrongly, the extremists not only becomes more powerful, but more of them begin to join the fold. The feedback loop, just quite simply, causes more extremism. Now, the cure. If we're going to focus on the cure, my partner likes to talk about this as if it's an illness. The cure starts with this idea. There are different populations, and you have to treat them differently. All right, so far, we've spoken about, the extremists, and then we've spoken about the tribal members. When we think about the extremists, here's one way to think about them. They're the infected. All right, they're the group of people who there is no known cure for. Now that seems bleak, but when you confront them with facts and when you confront them with experts, they actually will move away from you. They can become more violent. They can become more problematic. Now we have a series of worksheets on our website that you can go to, anywhere from your children to people who are in the workplace that you have to engage with that have these challenges, that give you a way to try to work your way through it. But the bottom line is, when you confront them with facts, you actually increase the chance of them going violent. The answer with them is listen, focus them on other priorities. Now, I'm not talking about if you're in a political debate with someone, and God only knows we're all in a political debate on our Facebook or Instagram, and God only knows why. But in everyday life, the reality is that when we meet that group of people, we're much better off to just simply to get them to focus on their other priorities. In fact, it's them losing perspective on those other priorities that makes them more violent. If it's a radical Islamist all the way to somebody who is much more radical on the left or on the right, if they generally have other priorities, their family members, their job, the ability to go out and hike. But oftentimes, the ideology begins to overpower those, and they say, well, if this doesn't get fixed, my family's screwed and my job is screwed. And so everything begins to revolve around the ideology. The best thing that we can do to help those people is to help move them away from it. Now, then there's the immune, all right? We've taken a long look at this, and we're a big promoter of how we can actually create change. But the unaffiliated voter is much more likely to be immune than the partisan voter because they don't feel like they need to defend the tribe. In fact, they begin to feel like what's important is that they maintain their independence. Here's good news. 49% of the United States in the last Gallup poll identified with being an independent. And today, 44% of the voters are actually registered as unaffiliated or as an independent. They just quite simply have a higher level of self-agency. And that happens because they identify as an individual. Now then there's the at risk. I like this because the last slide was, 2 slides ago was a zombie, and this is the zombies chasing the what seems to be like the one last person who's not infected yet. But we're all at risk. We're all at risk because we all have a set of beliefs that we believe in. And part of what we have to be able to do is not to abandon our values, not to abandon our beliefs, but to be respectful of other people's beliefs as well. The at risk, they're generally inside one of the 2 political parties. I love what was said by Thomas Jefferson. He said, never surrender the entirety of your thinking to any political party or to any man. Right? We follow the Constitution in the United States, but the more that we focus on the individual, the less that we focus on what group you're in, the better off we ourselves will be. And the immune, obviously these last 2 slides come from the Apple ad that was done, and this was the individual that broke down the face of Big Brother. The immune are those people who set themselves aside. See yourself as an individual, and then just as importantly, actually more importantly, see other people that way as well. Now, reforms. The single biggest reform is trying to give equality to the independent or the unaffiliated voter. Again, the perception is half the public is Republican, half is Democrat. Well, this is the reality. Start with this. About half the public's not registered in a political party. Just about half anyway, 44%. Of those people who are inside the political party, the remaining population, in high turnout primaries, it's about 35 to 40%. You do that math, and what you'll find is that less than 8% of the public vote in those partisan primaries and vote in the Democratic primary, and less than 8% vote in the Republican primary. And again, while the infected is less than 3% of the population, they make up sometimes up to 50% of the primary turnout vote. They have disproportionate representation. They're more motivated, and they show up inside the partisan primary, where oftentimes, usually, independent and unaffiliated voters, even though they have to help pay for it, can't take part in it. So the inequity problem, the system now, because the Democrats and Republicans don't really want independents or unaffiliated voters to run, they cause them to have to get, depending upon where you're in the country, 6 to 10 times the amount of signatures. In Arizona, Republicans need about 7,000 signatures. Democrats need about 7,000. Other voters, people who are unaffiliated, they need 43,000 signatures. And I can tell you, for the most part, it's unachievable. You can't get that done in the amount of time that they've allocated. In addition to that, they're forced to pay for those primary elections, the voters are, and they can't participate in it. Our system is fundamentally unfair to that group of voters. Independent and unaffiliated voters now represent the largest voting bloc in the United States, with 49% according to Gallup. The existing system, quite simply, is designed to stop competition. Again, less than 8% of the public vote in the Democratic primary and less than 8% in the Republican primary. And here's where that becomes a challenge. Because of gerrymandered districts, of the 5,000 elected seats in the United States, 70% of them are decided in the primary. And what that means is that less than 8% of the public ends up electing the individual, and they then have no opposition in the general. Not only is that not good for the system, because not everyone's really getting to vote for them, it ends up leading to many of the candidates being much more extreme, because I can promise you, in that 35% of the people who do vote in the primary, which again, because half are independents, really only about 16%, they're a much more extreme voter proportionately. What that's led us to, that even though about half of the country identifies as an independent, there's only one in the U.S. Congress, and it's almost impossible in most states for anyone to get there. So the results is leadership seems to be failing. 16% of the voters think that the United States is headed in the wrong direction. They have misaligned priorities. 70% of the voters do not believe that their elected officials are focused on the issues that they care most about. And the reason for that is because they don't. Most of the voters just quite simply have no effect on the elected officials inside the existing system. Only about 8% do, and that's who they're trying to appeal to. And very little is getting done. 69% of the voters do not believe that politicians are delivering the results that they want. So the reforms, a fair primary, and a top 5 general, at least is what I tend to support. The fair primary gives all candidates collecting the same number of signatures. All candidates compete under the same set of rules. Parties don't control the process, and more competition amongst candidates. More voters decide who advance, and it eliminates the advantages of gerrymandering. Now, top 5 with an instant runoff, that's really a choice. Some people like top 2, some like top 3. Alaska just did a top 4. I like the top 5, and I like the top 5 because voters rank their choices. It incentivizes a cleaner campaign. It's really hard to run a negative campaign when you have 5 people inside that primary, because Mo Udall used to say, "He who throws mud loses ground." Well, that's absolutely true in a top 5 type system. It also gives independents a fair shot. In every single industry, we always see technological improvements that happen that create a better product, but not in our political system. And that's because the duopoly, the 2 political parties, have created an environment where it's very, very difficult for any change to take place. So in Arizona, we're running an initiative, and the initiative is one that's being modeled in other states, and we've modeled it off of the handful of states that have already been successful. But it just starts with this, ensuring that every registered voter will be able to vote in every election for the candidate that they want. Now, I'm going to make a little bit of a shift with you, and I'm going to go back to talking about how these two extremes tend to see people as part of a group as opposed to seeing people as an individual. You know, I've seen a lot of great things that have happened inside of my government. I've seen, you know, I was, again, mayor of Phoenix, and I've seen us build bridges and roads. We ended up landing people on the moon, for gosh sakes, and we've done some pretty wonderful things. But the single most powerful thing that our government ever did, the best thing that it ever did, was from the very, very beginning, it empowered the individual over itself. Now, that idea didn't just come out of the clear blue sky. In fact, one of the reasons why it's taken hold more in Western society than in other places throughout the planet was that it actually was partly tied to Christian Judeo values. I know sometimes that's almost the point that they turn off the show, but the reality is, I mean, if you just look at Martin Luther created the Reformation. And what was the Reformation about? Well, he was saying to the Catholic Church at the time, hey, we don't need to go to you for indulgences, that every single human being has a direct connection to God. And his belief in that was that because it had a direct connection to God, that you had this binary ability to make the decision for yourself. Now that began to evolve with other philosophers who later on began to turn that into a more secular idea by saying, well, if God owes each individual dignity, doesn't government owe each individual dignity? So we created this system where the individual ended up being at the center. And what we've created from that has been unbelievable. You know, the United Nations, back during the time I was mayor, they actually made a challenge. And the challenge was to reduce poverty in half by 1995. Amazingly enough, not only did we do it, we far exceeded the results. You can see in this that people living on less than $1.25 a day, which is, well, that sounds terrible. That is what puts you into the lowest poverty group inside the world, went from being about half of the population to less than 14% by 2015. And we've cut it in half again. There's no doubt, free markets, capitalism, what we've done in the United States, it's done more to move human progress than any nation at any other point in history. So let's talk about the things that you need to do if you want to try to keep that sense of agency. What's important for you? And it absolutely starts with this concept of you have to know the truth. Start with this truth. The U.S. and our allies were unrivaled in terms of world power. One of my favorite historians is Paul Kennedy, and he says the greatest superpower ever is the United States. We represent about 5% of the world's population, yet we make up 31% of the global wealth. We make up 35% of world innovation. We make up 40% of the world's military. And we have 590 companies of the top 2,000 companies. The truth is, the North American market is going to be one of the strongest producers in the world. We're headed for one of the greatest job markets in history. 8.4 million jobs are going to be created from 2021 to 2031. We're seeing a revitalization of onshoring. Why? Well, because the new Cold War that's happening with China had decided to enter into this whole concept of wolf diplomacy, trying to put us back on our heels, believing that they had gotten to the point where they no longer needed us, and they began to become much more aggressive. So United States companies, knowing that there's an oncoming storm, began to move back here on shore. And we're seeing a huge benefit for it in jobs. In fact, if you look at our challenge, we all know there's an inflation problem. What's the inflation problem caused from? Monetary policy played a role. But also what's playing a role is that we have a lot of millennials that are moving into their buying years, and we don't have enough product. Supply and demand is at play. We're going to double industrial output over the next 5 years. And when we do, we're going to create one of the greatest job markets in history. One of the things that we have to do as a citizen, one of the things that we have to do if we're going to be immune, is we have to understand our own accountability. You know, one of my favorite individuals was a guy by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And if you haven't read the book, The Gulag Archipelago, I highly recommend reading it. But even if you don't read it, become familiar with it. It changed the world. And it changed the world because what Alexander Solzhenitsyn saw was that he had been in a prisoner of war camp in Germany. And then when he came back, Stalin didn't know what to do with him, so he ended up putting him into the Gulag. Now, he had every right to be angry and upset about going there, but instead, he began taking a look at what he had done wrong. You see, he was a member of the Communist Party, and one of his jobs was to move people, literally to relocate people that were called kulaks. They were poor farmers designated as being a rich farmer because they had one cow, to take their property from them and to move them into Siberia. Now, why move them? Well, when you take people's property from them, not all of them are going to shut up. And so you have to do something with them. He moved himself, he said, about 10,000 families or 60,000 people. He said they all died, literally in their first winter in Siberia. He said that he was able to justify doing that as a member of the military because he was a part of the Communist Party and he believed that communists were good. And he said, because we believed we were good, then they were evil. Good and evil doesn't exist as an external force. Good and evil is inside of each one of us. Each of us have the capacity to be either one. So what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said was that ideology becomes a way that you can transfer that evil outside of you into a group. And the number one key that he did is he was in this gulag was he began to preach and talk about the importance of being accountable for the role that you played. Well, think about that in today's terms. Are the things that you're doing actually making it better? Or are you making it worse? You know, one of my, I have 9 brothers and sisters. I love every one of them. One of them was a gunny in the Marine Corps. He's a tough guy. He and I would go running, and one day as we were running, we got into some argument, and I made the point. I said, oh, what'd you do? Did you learn that from Fox News? Now, he literally didn't talk to me for about 2 months. And of course, I'm the older brother, so my first answer to that is grow up. But the reality is, I have to be accountable for my role. I mean, look, why was I saying that? Right? I was saying that to belittle him. In other words, he's getting the news or information from a less superior place than mine. There was no reason to do that. Right? There was no reason not to listen to him, not to try to understand where he was coming from. And this is for certain. Don't give up on the people you love for people you don't even know. These people in politics, you don't know them. And I'll be honest with you, they don't really, most of them don't care that much about you. Don't give up on the people closest to you because you want to make a point with them. Strength over adversity. Here's an area where I really am worried about what's happening on our college campuses. Although I do think that there's a lot of change that's happening, but college campuses are now kind of confronting this whole idea of having to have these safe places where people are worried about people who step onto campus who might have a differing point of view. So Ann Coulter and Bill Maher and a number of others end up being banned from college campuses. That is a terrible idea. Look, this whole idea of fragility, human beings we have to be anti-fragile. We have to have the ability to be able to deal with conflict to be successful. And you don't gain that from not listening to other people. Free speech is a very, very powerful idea. It's you come up with an idea that might be crazy. I counter that with something that might be a little less crazy. Other people listen to it. They add on top of it. And the best ideas raise to the top. Now, you don't have to do that with fighting, but you can't do that without listening. You have to play a role in allowing and engaging more people to take part of it. And certainly, our college campuses are one of the most important places where that needs to happen. One of the big challenges for people, and this doesn't matter if you're an alcoholic or somebody who's suicidal, finding meaning. In fact, even beyond those two groups that I just mentioned, there's probably nothing more important than you can do than finding your sense of purpose. And what we found is that there are a variety of places where you can find purpose. You find it in the people that you love, people or things that you love. You can find it in the things that you create, in your business, in your job, in your art or your music. You find it in helping other people. And oftentimes, when you're confronted with the absolute worst, you find it in struggle. I love Viktor Frankl, who this picture is of. Viktor talked about this whole idea of finding it in struggle because there, when you have no other option left, the one option you have left is free will, the ability to see things the way that you want to see them. He was in Auschwitz, in a Nazi concentration camp, and if you get a chance to listen to any of his videos or read The Meaning of Life, I highly recommend it. The Power of Love. Now here, I'm going to go to another Martin Luther. This one was Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King talked about there being 3 different types of love. He said that, and he took this from the Greeks, but he said that one type was the romantic type of love. The other was called philia love. It's brotherly love. Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. But the third one was this concept of agape. It was a more divine type of love. The Greeks saw it that way. Martin Luther saw it that way. The ability to love people, not only that you don't even know, but sometimes that are your enemies. Now, that doesn't mean being chummy with them, but it means being respectful of them. It means not returning to them the same type of vitriol that they're giving to you. I know, I'm not the type of person that really likes to stand by and have people abuse me. That's just not in my nature. But I also know that sometimes when other people are watching, more specifically, that if you end up feeding back the same anger and vitriol that they're giving you, nobody knows who's to blame. And second, you didn't hear anything. And third, there's always a defense to hatred. There's never a defense to love. I really would like to stress to you that you're part of something awesome. In the United States, we're starting to defile many of our old leaders. We're starting to try to judge them by today's standards. Here's what I can tell you. The heroes of American society, none of them were perfect people. In fact, there aren't any perfect people. Most of the people who are creating the moral crusade against them today aren't even close to being as perfect as they were. But no one is perfect. We honor our heroes because they contributed to this idea of the individual, of putting the individual at the center of what we do. And so Thomas Jefferson, who had certainly moral failings and owned slaves, he wrote those words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He advanced that cause more than anyone else at the time. Martin Luther King had huge failures, huge problems that today might not do all so well inside of a Me Too community. But he also moved forward this idea that we should judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Again, focused on the idea of an individual. There's this arc in our society where you can see great things are happening here and you're a part of it. Honor it. It doesn't mean to deny what went wrong. It doesn't mean to try to avoid things that we did that weren't completely right. But there's no doubt in my mind, we are dramatically more moral than what we're seeing happening in the authoritarian governments. In fact, this whole idea of relativism that's happening in world politics really bothers me. The idea that, that we aren't any better than Russia. Of course we're better than Russia. One, because we have a society focused on the individuals. Do we have systems that are corrupt? All systems become corrupt. But what happens is when you have a check and balance system, when you have the ability for free speech, when you have the ability to criticize your government, you also end up with having this check that ends up ensuring that it doesn't go too far off the rail. And that brings me to the last thing. This isn't about me. And in fact, it should never be about me. It should be about we. Now, that we, it includes those extremes. And sometimes that's annoying. They deserve the right to have speech every bit as much as I do. They have the right to be able to speak up about their ideas. If we're going to be able to survive, we have to be able to listen to them, sometimes find agreement with them, sometimes try to understand where they're coming from, but never give up on the core concept that a society based around the individual is powerful, and that those views that they have about power, about group identity and identity politics, they just simply aren't ideas that are compatible with the ideas that we have since our founding. So, Again, I did this show because I've done this presentation now in front of a lot of groups. I always do it with a microphone that oftentimes isn't that good. So I was asked by a number of folks to try to put something together where it would be more visible. We decided to put it up on our show. There's a link to our book on the optimisticamerican.com. I hope you'll consider becoming a premium member. Also, if you're interested in the reform effort, today it's called Save Democracy. I think we're going to be renaming it Make It Fair. But I always appreciate your comments. And I get some comments on here that sometimes are pretty rough. I kind of like the rough ones just as well. I enjoy hearing and trying to understand where people are coming from. I think it makes me better. I think it makes me stronger. And I also think it helps us have a better message. If you like the message that we have, certainly become a subscriber, become a premium member. But no matter what, thank you so much for being a part of this show. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.